I rented a small hunting cabin deep in the woods for the season. It was the kind of place most people passed by without noticing. A rough, wooden structure tucked into a hollow surrounded by dense pines and spruces. The smell of damp earth and pine needles hit me before I even stepped inside, and the air carried the crisp bite of early winter. The cabin itself was modest. One main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen corner, a bedroom in the back, and a narrow staircase leading to a low attic. The landlord had mentioned the attic only once, in a casual, almost dismissive way. He said it wasn't safe and that I should never go up there. The way he said it made me curious more than anything else, a little challenge dangling at the edge of my mind. At first, settling in was a relief. I unpacked slowly, arranging things so the cabin felt like mine, even if only for a few months. The floorboards creaked under my weight. The walls seemed thin enough that I could hear the trees rubbing against the siding outside, and the chimney smoked in uneven bursts. There was a rhythm to it, a rough, honest sense of solitude that was easy to sink into. I liked knowing that for miles around, there wasn't another human being stirring. The silence was almost physical, pressing against my ears when the wind died down, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or the soft scurry of some animal through the underbrush. The attic door was small and tucked above the main room. It blended with the ceiling, painted the same dull brown as the surrounding boards. At first, I ignored it, thinking of it like the landlord suggested. Off limits, probably dangerous. Weeks passed and I moved through the cabin without ever thinking about what lay above me. The winter light grew weaker and earlier, and the early nights felt long. That's when the sound started. It came at first as a faint dragging noise. I woke one night around 1:30, hearing it above the ceiling, just over my head. It wasn't the steady rhythm of footsteps. It had a weight to it, like something being pulled across the wood. I stayed still for a moment, listening. The sound moved slightly, hesitant, not continuous. It could have been the roof settling, a branch falling against the siding, a raccoon or squirrel in the rafters. That was the rational explanation I clung to, though a cold tension had already settled in my chest. Eventually, curiosity won. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the narrow stairs, each step groaning beneath me. The attic door was light in my hands, the latch stiff but not locked. Inside, the room was small, just enough space to crouch. The ceiling sloped sharply, and the walls were lined with dark, rough boards. Dust hung in the air, caught in the beam of my flashlight, and the air smelled of old wood, something faintly sour beneath it. The floor was clear except for faint scratch marks, deep grooves in the wood that trailed across the boards. They were uneven, random, the kind of marks made by something heavy scraping against the surface. I leaned over them, running my fingers lightly above the grooves, trying to convince myself they had been there for years, that they weren't fresh. But the wood was splintered at some points, raw and jagged, and the scratches ended abruptly in the middle of the room, as though whatever made them had stopped. My heart beat faster, my palms clammy. I left the attic quickly, closing the door behind me and making sure the latch caught. I told myself it was nothing, that the isolation and long nights were playing tricks on me. The following days were uneventful. I went about my routines, chopping wood, checking traps, cooking over the fire, watching the snow begin to cover the ground. The cabin felt normal again, but the memory of those scratches lingered, the sensation of the weight above me like a subtle pressure on my skull. At night, I double-checked the latch on the attic door, my imagination filling in empty corners with moving shapes. A week later, I woke to the blankets being tugged off me. It wasn't a sudden jerk, but a deliberate pull, a slow tug that shifted the weight of the covers until I could feel the chill of the room on my skin. I sat up instantly, chest tight, and my eyes went straight to the ceiling. The attic door was wide open, its hinges creaking faintly in the still air. I remembered locking it before bed. Every logical thought in my mind screamed at me that it was impossible, that I must have forgotten. I even told myself I could have sleepwalked, though I'd never done such a thing in my life. I left the bed carefully, trying to make no sound, and approached the door. The hallway was cold, the shadows long and jagged in the weak light of the early morning. I pushed the attic door fully open and peered inside. It was empty. No footprints, no objects out of place. Just the same sloped ceiling, the same walls, and the faint scratches on the floorboards, now slightly more pronounced in the morning light. I ran my hand over them again, but this time the splinters caught on my skin. It felt recent, as though whatever had been up there had come down during the night. My pulse was sharp, the air sticky in my throat. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, listening to the house. Every shift in the wind, every soft creak of the floorboards made me flinch. By morning, I made a decision I hadn't wanted to admit until then. The cabin was not safe for me. I packed my things as quickly and quietly as possible, careful not to leave any sign of my panic behind. Outside, the snow was falling steadily, the pines heavy with white. The world looked calm and perfect, but I didn't linger. I locked the cabin one last time and left, the road back to the main highway feeling impossibly long. I never returned. Later, I learned the previous renter had left mid-season too, though the landlord never mentioned why. The attic remained closed and unused, a small, sealed space above the main room. I tried to rationalize everything, wind shifting something above, small animals, maybe even my own forgetfulness, but none of it explained the scratches or the tug on the blankets. I knew I would never go back, not even to satisfy curiosity. The memory of the quiet, deliberate weight above me, moving in a room I was told to ignore, stayed with me. It became something I carried like a shadow, a small, unnerving reminder that some warnings should not be tested, that some doors are better left closed. By the time Christmas arrived, I was in my apartment in the city, the lights bright and warm, the sounds of people moving and talking a comfort I hadn't realized I missed. I thought about the cabin often, the cold, empty air of the attic, the scratches, the weight, and the blankets. The memory never softened, but it no longer haunted me in the same way. It was contained, a single season and a single mistake. I never told anyone the full story because it sounded foolish, impossible even. But I knew the truth. The cabin had a history, one I had brushed against, and whatever it was up there, it was deliberate, precise, and quiet enough to vanish without trace. I had no need to test it further. I stayed away, and that was enough. I inherited a cabin from an uncle I barely knew, a man whose letters were sparse and whose visits were rarer. The paperwork arrived quietly, almost casually, with a single note from him scribbled at the bottom. "It's yours now. Fix it up." The cabin sat on the edge of a forested stretch, the kind of land where the trees grew thick enough to block the sky in patches, and the air smelled of damp pine and wet soil. I drove out late afternoon, the sun low and warm, the shadows stretching across the unpaved road. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly as he had described it in a single line of typewritten text. Rustic, weathered, and unlocked. The lock on the front door hadn't been touched in years. The wood was gray in spots, darker where rain had seeped through the gaps in the roof, and the small porch sagged slightly on one side. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight, the smell of old wood and dust thick in the air. The living room was small, furnished with nothing but a threadbare couch, a coffee table scarred with scratches, and a wood stove whose blackened interior suggested years of use. I moved through the cabin systematically, checking the windows, the doors, the kitchen that had barely any appliances, and the bedroom, which smelled faintly of mildew. Everything seemed to be in place, untouched but intact, as if my uncle had walked out one day and never returned. That first night, I stayed up later than I intended, sitting in the living room with a lantern on the table, the shadows from the flame flickering across the walls. The forest pressed close, the wind rustling through the pine needles, and somewhere far off, a branch snapped. I was settling in when the front door slammed so hard it shook the walls. It startled me enough to make me jump from the couch. My first thought was wind, though the air was still. I got up, lantern in hand, and went from one door to another, testing each one. Every window, every latch, every lock was secure. I pressed my ear against the doorframe, listening, but all I heard was the soft settling of the cabin and the distant sound of the forest at night. I waited, thinking maybe I had imagined it, when I noticed a faint noise in the corner of the living room. At first, I thought it was the wind again, shifting through the trees and carrying the sound inside. But it was different. It was a whisper, low and quick, so soft I couldn't make out the words. I froze, trying to listen, trying to convince myself it was the house settling. I stayed where I was, eyes wide, heart thumping, until the sound faded entirely. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat near the stove, the lantern throwing warm light across the floorboards, occasionally glancing at the dark corner where the sound had come from. The cabin was otherwise silent, the shadows moving slowly, almost imperceptibly. Morning came quietly. Sunlight filtered through the pine trees, falling in thin lines across the floor. I stepped outside for fresh air and to shake off the tension from the night. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn slightly. A circle of stones, perfectly aligned around the cabin, not more than a foot apart from each other. They were smooth and gray, each one carefully placed. I hadn't seen them when I arrived. I had walked around the cabin, I had checked every side. But there they were. The circle didn't seem threatening, but its symmetry and precision suggested deliberate placement, and it set me on edge. I knelt, inspecting the stones, running my fingers over the surfaces, looking for any sign of how or when they had appeared. There was nothing in the soil to indicate a recent disturbance. The grass was slightly pressed, but only where the stones lay. I walked around the cabin slowly, examining every angle. The circle was complete, perfect, and precise, hugging the cabin like a frame, almost as if it had been laid out with careful measurements. My rational mind searched for explanations. Perhaps the stones had been hidden in the overgrowth, pushed aside or covered by leaves, only to be revealed by the wind or rain. But I had been careful the day before. I had walked every step. I had noticed nothing, and there had been no wind, no movement that could account for them appearing overnight. I took pictures with my phone, just to document, and tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation. I spent the day exploring the property, hoping to tire myself out enough to sleep. The cabin's interior felt strange now. Every shadow stretched, every floorboard creaked sharper in my mind. I checked the corners of each room more carefully than before, as if my attention could prevent the return of the whispering. The forest behind the cabin was thick, tangled, and dark in the mid-afternoon light. I walked along the narrow path that led away from the cabin, listening to birds, the occasional rustle of small animals, anything that might reassure me. When I returned, I brought firewood inside, stacked it neatly beside the stove, checked the doors and windows again, and made a simple dinner over the lantern's light. The evening passed slowly, uneventful, with only the forest sounds outside and the occasional crackle from the wood stove. That night, I decided to stay despite my unease. I told myself I needed closure, that I couldn't leave without understanding why the first night had felt so strange. I placed the lantern on the coffee table, sat on the couch and stared at the shadows. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. I kept my eyes on the corner where I had first heard the whispering, muscles tense, ears straining. Hours passed. The wind outside picked up slightly, brushing the tops of the trees and rustling the branches. I could hear the distant hum of insects, the occasional snap of a twig, but nothing unusual happened. No whispers returned. The cabin settled in its usual way, the floorboards creaking softly under my movements, the walls shifting slightly with the temperature change. I realized gradually that the sound had not returned, that the cabin was, in fact, just a cabin, old and quiet. I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment, as if the absence of the unexplained left a hollow weight in the room. Morning came again, slow and calm. I stepped outside once more, expecting, fearing, that something new would have appeared. The circle of stones remained, unchanged. I examined it carefully. The grass around the stones was pressed in the same way, the ground firm, untouched. I realized then that it was not the whispering, nor the door, nor any sudden appearance of stones that defined my experience. It was my own mind adjusting to the new environment, parsing out shapes, sounds, and patterns in a place it had not yet accepted as familiar. I considered that my uncle, in his quiet way, might have simply left the stones for reasons of his own. A personal project, an old habit, a mark of territory. The whispering, I concluded, had been the house itself, old and creaking, with air moving in ways I had not fully noticed, magnified by the darkness and my unfamiliarity. The door had slammed due to pressure differences inside the cabin. Nothing more. I spent one more day inspecting the cabin, repairing the small leaks, sanding rough spots, and cleaning accumulated dust. The second night passed without incident. I slept in peace, waking to sunlight cutting across the floorboards, the circle of stones still framing the cabin as it had the day before. I packed up my tools, noting what I could repair or improve over the coming months, feeling a sense of satisfaction I hadn't anticipated. I realized that the cabin, with all its quirks and oddities, was simply old, a structure pressed into the forest, shaped by years of weather and human hands, and that my imagination had filled in the spaces where my understanding faltered. The strange events of the first night had not returned, and in that absence, I found clarity. I walked around the cabin one final time before leaving, touching the wood, examining the stones, breathing the forest air deeply. I felt a connection to the place, quiet and grounded, a recognition that some things would remain unexplained, yet perfectly ordinary once understood. The cabin waited for me, solid and unchanged, ready for whatever care I chose to give it, and I drove away with a sense of calm, certain now that my uncle's gift was not haunted or dangerous, but simply a quiet, enduring place, full of stillness, to be tended, understood, and lived in. I was hired to winterize a cabin deep in the mountains. The contract was simple. Make sure the heating worked, seal the windows and doors, check the plumbing, and leave it ready for the season. The address was on a rough, unpaved road that twisted through thick stands of pine. By the time I got close, the snow was knee-deep and packed in drifts against the sides of the trees. I had to leave my truck where the road ended and hike the last quarter mile with my tools strapped to my back. The wind was sharp, carrying the smell of wet pine and frozen earth, and the sky was gray, heavy with snow clouds that pressed low over the mountains. The isolation hit first. There was no sound beyond the crunch of my boots in the snow and the faint, distant groan of tree limbs swaying under their icy weight. The cabin itself was small, made of logs darkened by years of weather. Snow clung to the roof in thick layers, and the path leading up to the door had long been covered. I worked methodically, checking the pipes first. They had been drained, but the taps were stiff from cold. I opened the windows just enough to let the cold air in and check for drafts. The heater was old but functional. I cleaned the vents and tested it, watching the flame stabilize. Steam hissed from a small radiator as warmth slowly filled the room, pushing the winter chill back into the corners. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood and something metallic from the heater, a scent that reminded me of my father's workshop when I was a kid. I moved through the place slowly, checking every joint, every seam, every shuttered window. Outside, the wind made the trees sway in uneven patterns, their branches scraping against each other in a dry, metallic rhythm. The snow around the cabin was untouched, perfect, a thick, uniform blanket that would have made footprints easy to see. I finished my work just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the last light fading in streaks of red and orange that touched the tips of the pines before vanishing entirely. By 11:43, I had wrapped up tools and was sitting near the heater, my jacket loosened and my gloves off, thinking I could finally relax for the night. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind. It was slow, careful, deliberate footsteps crunching in the fresh snow outside. At first I thought maybe a deer had wandered too close, but the rhythm was too even, too purposeful. I froze, listening, straining to hear over the hiss of the heater and the soft groan of the cabin settling. The footsteps moved around the cabin. I could hear the snow compress under weight, turning softly to ice with each step. They circled it, around, slow, deliberate. Then they stopped. I couldn't tell how close they were. My heart was pounding, my hands clenched tight on my knees. I moved to the window, careful not to make any noise. The glass was frosted at the edges, but through the center, I could see the snow. Footprints led from the treeline, around the cabin, and stopped at the door. They were fresh, crisp, perfectly preserved in the quiet of the night. But I didn't see anyone. Not a shadow, not a shape, nothing that could explain the prints. The air outside was still except for the sound of wind in the pines. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the mind or an animal, but the prints were too large, too deliberate, too human. I didn't sleep in the cabin that night. Couldn't. I pulled on my coat, grabbed my sleeping bag, and went back to the truck I had left on the road. The engine had cooled, but I started it and let it run on idle, the heater blasting warmth into the cab. I watched the cabin from the driveway, the small structure half buried in snow, silent except for the occasional creak of timber. I could see the footprints leading to the door, frozen and unchanging in the pale light of the dashboard. I stayed there all night, moving only to check the mirrors and the path behind me, waiting for anything to happen, anything at all, but nothing did. By morning, the sun was low and weak, and the sky had cleared to a pale blue. The prints were still there, now sharp in the light, untouched since last night. I returned to the cabin, careful, my boots crunching over the same snow I had walked in the night before. The door was locked, the windows secure. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing out of place. I ran my hand along the wood walls, felt the warmth still emanating from the heater vents, and tried to make sense of it. There was no one, nothing. I finished the last checks quickly, sealed the windows again, made sure the pipes were ready for freezing temperatures, and packed my tools. The snow had softened in places from the sun, but the footprints remained, a perfect circle around the cabin door. I couldn't understand it. I thought about reporting it, leaving a note for the client, but I realized I would only sound paranoid. Whoever or whatever had made them was long gone. When I drove away, my tires crunching over the snow-packed road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The cabin receded into the forest, a small dark shape against the white snow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched all night. The thought stayed with me, hollow and cold, like the wind I had left behind in the trees. The client met me at the bottom of the mountain road, a small envelope of cash pressed into my hand. He didn't ask questions, didn't even glance at the truck or the snow around the cabin. Just a nod and a quiet thanks. I left, the money heavy in my pocket, and thought about the prints circling the cabin. I never understood them, never had a rational explanation. But I knew they were real, and I knew someone had been there. I told no one, not coworkers, not friends, because how do you explain footprints that appear without a person? How do you explain the sound of careful, deliberate walking outside a cabin that is cut off from the world, in snow so deep no one else could reach it unnoticed? I never went back, and I never wanted to. The memory is precise. I can see the circle of prints in my mind, the quiet of the night, the smell of cold pine and wood smoke, and the strange weight of being completely alone and yet not alone. It's been years, but every winter, when I drive past a snow-covered cabin or hear footsteps in the frost, I remember that night. I remember circling footprints that led to my door and stopped, and the decision to sleep in my truck. I remember the client's quiet payment and the unspoken understanding that some things are not meant to be questioned. The cabin was winterized, the heater left working, the pipes safe from freezing. I did my job just as I was hired to do. Beyond that, the rest remains a question I've never needed an answer to. A night I can still feel pressing against my shoulders, cold and silent. I hadn't seen my cousins in over a year, and when they invited me to spend a weekend at their family cabin perched on a bluff above the ocean, I didn't hesitate. The cabin had been empty for years. They said it had a view like nothing else, a wide sweep of cliffs and waves that made the rest of the world disappear. I imagined the mornings with the sun catching the water, the smell of salt carried on the wind, and the quiet except for the occasional gull. Driving up the narrow road, I noticed the weeds growing up around the edges of the path, and the paint on the cabin peeling from years of exposure to wind and salt. It had a worn look, more like it belonged to the land than to anyone. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, but the structure was solid. The rooms were empty but spacious, with low ceilings in places and a loft that ran along one side. Windows framed the ocean so perfectly that it was easy to imagine sitting there for hours and forgetting the rest of the world. The first day passed quietly. We explored the cliffs, wandered the small trails through the scrubby brush, and watched the ocean churn below. By evening, the wind had picked up, carrying the cold smell of the water into the cabin. The air was damp, and the walls creaked faintly under the pressure of gusts. My cousins lit a small fire in the hearth, and for a while, the room glowed orange and warm, the shadows of the logs dancing on the walls. Outside, the ocean roared and the bluff seemed impossibly high. I went to bed early, tired from the hike and the drive, and left the fire dying down behind me. The cabin had only a single lamp on a table near the doorway, which we had turned off before climbing the stairs to the loft where the bed waited. I woke hours later to a noise I couldn't place. It was subtle at first, soft and irregular, like a boot brushing against loose gravel. The cabin was silent otherwise, and the sound seemed too deliberate to be the wind. My heart beat faster, but I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something larger moving along the porch. I slipped out of bed quietly and crept to the small window near the stairs that looked out over the porch. The lamp in the cabin didn't reach the outside, and everything beyond the threshold was black. The porch itself was empty, though the wood creaked under the wind, and I couldn't see any movement. I waited, holding my breath, and then the sound shifted. Footsteps moved from one side of the porch to the other, careful, slow, deliberate. I froze. The footsteps continued past the front corner, scraping lightly against the boards, and then I realized they were heading toward the back of the cabin. I could see the dark outline of trees through the window at the edge of the porch. For a moment, a shadow moved behind them, too large to be any deer or fox I had seen before. Then it was gone and the steps stopped. I strained my eyes into the darkness, waiting, but nothing came closer. I retreated to the loft, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal, though my stomach refused to settle. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind on the side of the cabin, made me tense. I lay in the bed listening for more footsteps, more shadows, more movement. Dawn came slowly. The sky over the ocean was pale and muted, gray and pink where the sun barely pushed through clouds. I went outside, barefoot, to the edge of the bluff where the sand was soft and pale. That's when I saw the prints. They weren't human, at least not in any way I recognized. They were bare, narrow, and long, with a kind of taper I had never seen. They ran along the sand near the edge, twisting slightly as if the person had been balancing on the wind-blown slope. I measured them roughly against my own feet. They were at least 2 sizes larger than mine, far longer than any of my cousin's feet. The prints didn't show toes clearly, only the vague outline of a long, narrow foot, and they ended abruptly at a point where the sand dropped off sharply toward the ocean. It was impossible to tell where they came from, only that they had walked close to the bluff and then vanished. I followed the line of prints a little, tracing them with my fingers. They were pressed into soft sand that had dried overnight, and there were no other prints around them. No signs of anything that might have passed through from the other side. The ground beyond the bluff dropped into jagged rocks, and the tide was far enough out that the water could not have carried anything there. I looked around at the cabin and the surrounding trees. Nothing. The wind moved the branches gently, the ocean rolled under the morning light, and the birds called intermittently from somewhere far below. But the feeling of eyes watching me clung to my skin like a wet cloth. I went back inside, locked the door carefully, and told myself I was imagining things. A raccoon, a wandering hiker, someone who had sneaked in for shelter from the wind. Any explanation that kept it human, any logic that kept it from being something I couldn't name. The rest of the weekend passed slowly. I didn't leave the cabin alone after that first morning. I stayed close to my cousins whenever we went down the narrow trails or near the bluff. We cooked meals together in the small kitchen, keeping the windows closed and the curtains drawn. Even in daylight, the place felt unsettled. I noticed small things, the door latch that had been perfectly aligned now slightly crooked, the faint scuff marks near the threshold of the porch that weren't there the day before, the low rumble of the wind that sounded almost like a footstep on the boards. I slept little, and when I did, I kept my shoes on. I would wake at the slightest creak, the smallest scratch, and I would stare into the darkness, waiting. By the time I left, I felt drained in a way that climbing, hiking, or long days in a city could never achieve. I left early, while my cousins still slept, carrying a small bag and leaving the cabin behind. On the drive down, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the bluff, imagining shadows that weren't there. I didn't speak much on the way back. I kept thinking about the prints, about the way the footsteps had circled the cabin the first night, about the shadow that had moved too quickly behind the trees. I never saw anyone there, never found evidence of another human. And yet, the marks on the sand, the faint scuff on the porch, the sound of deliberate steps in the darkness, they were all real. I replayed it in my mind endlessly, trying to rationalize, trying to find some natural explanation. But nothing fit. I never went back alone. My cousins eventually returned a few months later for another weekend, and I stayed home making excuses about work. Even when they described the weekend, the cabin's weather, the cliffs, the waves, I felt a tight knot in my stomach just imagining it. They never saw anything unusual themselves, though I told them about the footprints and the night sounds. They smiled uneasily, told me it was probably just an animal, maybe a wandering beachcomber, but I knew better. The bluff was high, the sand soft, the trees thick. Nothing should have made prints like that, and nothing should have circled the cabin in the dark without being noticed. And yet it had happened. I knew it had. Months later, when I passed that stretch of coast on a drive, I kept my eyes on the bluff, on the cabin, and I could almost feel the same unease settle over me. It wasn't fear of ghosts or the supernatural, it wasn't that at all. It was the knowledge that something had been there, something deliberate, and it had walked so close to the edge that a single misstep would have sent it over the cliff. The prints remained vivid in my mind, the narrow, impossibly long shapes pressed into the sand, pointing toward the void. I never questioned my own senses. I knew what I had seen, and I knew what I had heard. I just refused to go back alone. The cabin, the bluff, the ocean below, the wind, they stayed in my mind, a quiet, insistent warning. I didn't need anyone to tell me what it meant. I had learned the lesson in the way the footsteps circled, in the way the shadow had moved behind the trees, in the silent imprint left in the sand at dawn. Some places, I realized, could hold a presence without ever showing themselves fully. And some weekends, some memories are best left alone. I never returned to the cabin by myself, and I never will. We rented the cabin for a week at the end of August, the kind that sits low on the shore of a lake, framed by pine trees that stretched in every direction. There was no cell service, no internet, no other houses visible. The approach road was little more than a dirt track, flanked by undergrowth, and it curved sharply several times before dumping into a small clearing where the cabin sat. The structure itself was simple, a rectangular wooden building with a pitched roof, wide windows, and a small porch facing the water. Inside, it smelled of pine, old varnish, and something faintly damp, a residue of winters past. The furniture was worn but solid, mismatched chairs around a long table, a few shelves with faded books, and a wood stove that dominated one corner. The air had a stillness to it, the kind you feel immediately when you step away from any modern noise. The first evening, after setting our things down and unpacking our backpacks, the fog began to roll in from the lake. It was gradual at first, a faint haze on the water's surface that blurred the outline of the far shore. But by nightfall it had thickened to the point where the lake itself vanished into a low, gray wall. The mist crept along the edge of the trees, pressing against the cabin, seeping into the space between the boards. Through the windows, I could see nothing beyond a few feet. The water, the trees, even the docks where the canoes were tied were swallowed by it. The fog held an almost physical weight, and when it drifted across the porch it left droplets on the wood that made the air smell damp and sharp. We lit the lanterns inside, but the glow barely reached the corners of the room, and the fog outside seemed to absorb it, leaving the world beyond the glass muted and distant. That night, I first heard the splashes. At first, I told myself they were fish, the occasional large carp or bass moving near the shore. But there was something in the rhythm that made me pause. They were too deliberate, too measured. They weren't the scattered, random movements of wildlife. Each splash seemed to follow the last with purpose, a slow, deliberate cadence that grew more pronounced the longer I listened. I tried to trace them to the dock, to the canoes, to anything I could see, but the fog made it impossible. The sounds seemed to come from all around, or perhaps just out there, just beyond the veil of mist. I stayed awake listening until the lanterns dimmed and the wood stove's last embers went cold. My brother was asleep on the couch, unaware, but the sounds stayed with me until I drifted off, uneasy. The second day was overcast, the sky a pale gray that pressed down on the forest. The fog had not lifted, remaining in the hollow of the lake like a slow-moving river of cloud. We spent the morning exploring the immediate area, walking along the tree line and peering into the gray that stretched outward. The water was flat, almost glass-like, and every now and then a ripple would pass through the mist, following a sound that was impossible to locate. By the second night, the splashes returned, and I noticed a pattern that was unmistakable. They were coordinated, almost mechanical, but subtle in their precision. It wasn't anything I could name, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. My brother was awake this time, standing by the window with his hands pressed to the glass. He squinted into the fog and froze. Later, he told me he had seen a shape, a figure taller than a man, moving just at the edge of visibility. Its limbs bent in ways that didn't make sense, but in the fog it was distorted, a silhouette that suggested something humanoid but wrong, like a shadow stretched over a frame it shouldn't fit. Neither of us spoke for long, and the rest of the night passed in careful, tense quiet, punctuated only by the soft, measured splashes. The next day we stayed inside, unable to shake the feeling that the fog itself was observing. The forest pressed in closer than before, the pines seeming taller, more crowded. The air was damp, heavy, and smelled faintly of the lake's stagnant edges. Even with daylight, visibility remained poor, the mist clinging to the water like a living thing. I found myself checking the windows more often, peering through the gray veil for any hint of movement. The canoes remained tied, untouched, and each time I looked at them I felt a faint pull of dread. I couldn't explain it, but the lake no longer felt natural. There was a silence under the fog, a stillness that suggested intent rather than absence. Something was out there, pacing just beyond the line of vision, unseen but unmistakable in its presence. By the third night, the sense of unease had hardened into something more tangible. The splashes continued, but now my brother saw it too, or at least something close enough to it. From the porch, he swore he glimpsed the same silhouette again, taller than any man, its limbs moving in a way that made the muscles and joints look wrong, impossible, but not supernatural. I could hear the water moving in careful, almost deliberate rhythms, the soft slaps of it against the shore as if measured. The fog had thickened further, curling against the cabin like smoke, and the air carried a cold dampness that seeped through clothes and skin. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow in the cabin stretched longer than it should, and the lantern light trembled against the shifting gray outside. We stopped opening windows, stopped venturing onto the porch, and I found myself leaning close to my brother to check for signs of fear or fatigue. He never blinked, never looked away from the mist. The cabin, once a retreat, felt enclosed, a fragile barrier holding something out and keeping us inside with it. The decision to leave came quietly, in the early hours before dawn. We packed methodically, taking only what we could carry, leaving the canoes and most of the gear behind. The fog hung low across the lake, solid and unbroken, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The drive back down the dirt road was slow, tires crunching over the gravel, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow in the mist following. But the road remained empty, the forest closing behind us as the first hints of sun broke through the clouds. The lake disappeared from view entirely once we turned the final bend, leaving only the memory of its oppressive stillness. When we reached the paved road, the sunlight seemed sharp, almost painful after the muted gray we had left behind, and a sense of relief hit that was immediate and total. We didn't return. The cabin remained, the canoes abandoned at the edge of the lake. For weeks afterward, I replayed the sounds, the rhythm of the splashes, the distorted silhouette, trying to make sense of it. My mind settled on rational explanations. Perhaps a deer, a large otter, or even a group of fish moving unusually in the shallow water, their activity amplified by the fog. The silhouette could have been a tree branch bent oddly, a trick of light and mist, my brother's eyes playing the same tricks as mine in the dimness. Yet, even after considering all possibilities, the memory of that week remained unsettling. The fog, the way it swallowed the lake and the trees, the weight of it pressing against the cabin, had a presence that felt more than simple atmosphere. It wasn't something supernatural. It was simply something out of place, something in nature behaving just slightly differently than expected, enough to make our senses distrust themselves. Years later, I can recall the sound of those splashes with clarity, the pattern of them, the way they seemed almost deliberate, and I can remember the distorted shape in the mist with perfect detail. I have no reason to doubt it was explainable. Everything I saw could be traced back to mundane sources, but the visceral fear it produced, the sense of being watched in a place that should have been empty, is impossible to rationalize entirely. The lake and its fog remain in my memory as a perfectly real place that, for a brief week, felt entirely alien. We left, intact but shaken, leaving the canoes behind, and never returned. The cabin still sits on the shore, the fog still rolls in from the lake, and whatever caused those splashes continues its slow, deliberate movements just beyond the edge of vision, unseen but unmistakable. We rented the cabin at the far end of the lake just after dawn, carrying our gear through the narrow dirt road that wound between thick spruce. The trees crowded the road so closely that sunlight fell in uneven, shifting patterns, and the air smelled damp, earthy, and sharp with resin. The lake itself was tucked into a natural hollow, flat and dark, reflecting the treeline like a mirror. There was no road noise, no distant hum of traffic, just the occasional rattle of dry branches in the wind. The cabin was small, wooden, and weathered, built on pilings that raised it slightly above the lake's edge. Its windows were streaked with rain and moss, the wood gray with age, and the door hung on creaky hinges. It had electricity, but the breaker box looked old, and the lights flickered when we tested them. The first day we spent unpacking and fishing along the shoreline. The spruce pressed so close to the water that in places the lake felt more like a channel, the current subtle but perceptible beneath the surface. We made a small fire on a cleared patch of ground near the cabin and cooked the fish we caught. The smoke curled lazily into the trees, and the lake lay still beyond, dark and cold. Shadows from the forest stretched long as the sun sank. The cabin's interior smelled of old pine and a faint, sour note like damp cloth. We set up sleeping bags and lanterns and tried to settle in for the night, our laughter filling the space in contrast to the oppressive quiet outside. Around midnight, the wind picked up and the spruce swayed. I noticed movement at the edge of the trees while sitting by the window. It was subtle, a thin silhouette crouched, shifting. I mentioned it to Jake, who shrugged. He said he thought he saw the same thing. The shape was tall, unnaturally thin, with a posture that seemed off, bent at the shoulders. We laughed it off, calling it a deer or some trick of the branches in the moonlight. But later, the dog started barking, a low, urgent sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. The barking was not random. It came from the dock. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the dark, glinting off the lake, but there was nothing on the dock, not a single figure. The water lapped quietly beneath the boards, small ripples running across the surface. The dogs continued to growl, refusing to leave the edge. I stood there for a long time, listening, seeing only shadows and the occasional flicker of wind-blown branches. The night dragged on, each creak of the cabin amplified. The old wood shifted under us, settling or perhaps reacting to the wind. Somewhere in the distance, branches snapped sharply, too deliberate to be normal forest sounds. I could feel it in my chest, that tension that grows when the world outside is too quiet yet full of movement you can't pinpoint. Sleep came in fits, light and shallow. I kept waking, expecting to see something at the edge of the room, something watching. When dawn finally arrived, it was a gray light filtering through thick clouds. The lake was still, the mist hovering over the water's surface, curling around the dock. That's when I noticed the canoe was gone. The small aluminum boat we had tied carefully the night before had vanished without a trace. No ropes, no signs of tampering, nothing. Only footprints led away from the dock into the trees. They were long, uneven, almost distorted in shape, like a human foot stretched too far, elongated and misshapen. I examined them closely. The spacing was too long for anyone of normal height. The prints cut through the moss and soft soil with heavy imprints, not light steps. They disappeared into the forest, swallowed by the dense undergrowth. We left immediately, carrying what gear we could. Breakfast was forgotten. The smell of cooking and coffee seemed alien, out of place. The drive back was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the road tight between the spruce. We spoke little, only acknowledging the occasional misaligned branch that scraped the side of the car or the way the clouds pressed close to the ground. By the time we reached the nearest town, the sun had broken through, warming the asphalt, the lake and cabin gone behind us in memory but heavy in mind. Later, thinking it over, we realized the situation had been entirely plausible without invoking anything supernatural. The canoe had likely been taken by someone familiar with the area, someone able to move silently through the forest and manipulate the dock without leaving ordinary signs. The elongated footprints could be explained by the type of boots or devices designed to create a stride longer than usual, perhaps for hunting or patrolling the lake. The shape Jake and I saw in the trees might have been a person wearing camouflage or hunched over while carrying something. The sounds at night, the barking, the cracking branches, all consistent with human movement through spruce and over rough ground. The cabin itself had contributed to the unease. Its age, the dark corners, the long shadows cast by sparse lighting, and the echoing noises of wood shifting all combined to make us hyper-aware, to read intent into normal sounds. The dogs sensed something, probably a stranger moving in the dark, an unfamiliar scent, but they gave no clue as to identity. In retrospect, the forest created an environment where our perception magnified ordinary events into something threatening. The lake's isolation, the dense spruce, and the narrow approach meant someone could move around unnoticed, unseen until the moment of discovery. The prints remain the most unnerving detail. They spoke to deliberate intent, precision, and preparation. Whoever had taken the canoe had done it quietly, carefully, likely returning to a hidden path we had missed entirely. The morning mist and low light provided cover, and the solitude of the lake meant no one else was around to witness or intervene. It was a calculated act, one designed to unsettle, to remove an asset without confrontation, leaving only the evidence that forced fear into our minds. We didn't return to the lake for years, and when we did, the cabin was abandoned. Boards were loose, windows cracked, the dock sagging. The canoe never reappeared. We explored cautiously, noticing the underbrush had grown over the prints, the path entirely hidden. There was nothing to confirm or contradict the experience. Just the forest, quiet and thick, and the sense that someone had been there and could be there again. The lesson stayed with me. Isolation magnifies uncertainty. The forest shapes perception. The human mind, exposed to strange shapes and quiet nights, will fill gaps with fear. And sometimes, things that seem impossible, unexplainable, are perfectly human, deliberate, and methodical. The unease came not from something supernatural, but from someone else, operating within the same space we assumed was empty, capable of moving through it with intent, patience, and knowledge. The lake, the cabin, the prints, they all remain real, tangible evidence that some threats are simply human, quiet, and precise. We learned, finally, to respect isolation, to leave early, and to trust instinct over laughter when the edges of the forest seem to watch. Even now, years later, I can picture the long stride in the soft soil, the elongated foot pressing into the moss, carrying away the canoe with purpose. I can remember the way the spruce swayed, the bark glistening with rain, and the way the dogs refused to leave the dock. Everything was concrete, real, and yet terrifying in its simplicity. The experience never needed anything else. The cabin by the lake, the forest, and a careful, patient person were enough. And that is what made it stay with me, sharp and unmistakable, a lesson in the kind of horror that doesn't need imagination, only reality. We left the lake that day, not in panic but in quiet acknowledgement. The forest kept its secrets, and we kept ours. That sometimes the most unsettling things are not ghosts or monsters, but humans moving through the same world we do, unseen, silent, and methodical. The canoe gone, the prints in the moss, the hushed early morning. These were proof enough, and proof, in its way, was far worse than any fiction.